Over the Santa Fe Trail, 1857, by W.B. Napton, narrated by Paul Beauheart. About the book. It's America in 1857. You needed to go west, young man, with Captain Chiles and his team on the Santa Fe Trail. While delivering valuable freight to the frontier, you'll encounter a wide variety of Native American tribes across the prairie. Some friendly, some hostile, and some looking to trade. To survive, you'll need to hunt buffalo, chase down herds of elk, and avoid the gray wolves. Don't forget to keep your cattle well fed and never fall asleep in a cactus patch. Come join the wagon train from Missouri to the New Mexico Territory and over Santa Fe Trail. Foreword. The American frontier in the 19th century was a dangerous but exciting place. If you could survive the harsh conditions out west, it was very profitable to homesteaders and traders alike. At the time, Native Americans could be either friendly or hostile, depending on the tribe. The United States Army was still involved in fighting off the more hostile tribes, which is depicted in the narrative. Buffalo were still very prevalent and provided a valuable source of food while traveling across the prairie. At the time, in 1857, the frontier was very attractive for young men looking for adventure. After the Civil War, it became the policy of the United States government to encourage young men to settle out west to overcome the trauma and grief of the war. Homesteading was possible for many decades, and the frontier was not closed until 1890. The Santa Fe Trail is recognized as a historic trail by the National Park Service, and you can view an interactive map on their website. I hope that you'll enjoy this exciting narrative of the Old West over the Santa Fe Trail. I'm Paul Beauheart, Bangkok, Thailand, March 2024. If you are enjoying this reading from Friendly Frog Press, please make sure to subscribe and hit that like button. If you'd like to purchase a copy of this book, it is available on Amazon in eBook and Paperback, and it is available on Audible as an audiobook. The links are in the description below, or you can check out friendlyfrogpress.com for purchasing options. Over the Santa Fe Trail by W.B. Napton, narrated by Paul Beauheart. Chapter 1. Captain Jim Crow Chiles. When I was a lad of 12 years of age, my father had a red-headed overseer, good-natured, loquacious, and fond of telling stories. The kind that suited the understanding and tickled the fancy of a boy. His stories were always related as being truthful accounts of actual occurrences, although I suspected they were frequently creatures of his own imagination. This overseer, a Westerner born and bred, had driven an ox wagon and a train across the plains to New Mexico, had made 2 trips across in 1847 and 1848, one extending as far as Chihuahua in Old Mexico. His observation was keen and his memory unexcelled, so that years afterwards he could relate in minute detail the events of every day's travel from the beginning to the end of the journey. I was charmed with his accounts of the Indians and buffalo, wolves, antelope, and prairie dogs. Reaching the age of 18 in 1857 with indifferent health, my father acquiesced in my determination to cross the plains to New Mexico. The doctor said the journey would benefit my health. Already an expert with a gun or pistol, I killed all kinds of game to be found in Missouri, and had read Gordon Cummings' book of his hunting exploits in South Africa, so I felt as if nothing less than killing big game like buffalo and elk could gratify my sporting proclivities. Colonel James Chiles of 6 Mile, Jackson County, was a state senator, and while at Jefferson City during the session of the legislature, my father telling him of my desire to go out to Santa Fe, the colonel sent me an invitation to come to his house by the middle of April and go out with a train belonging to his son. So in the early spring of 1857, I set out from my home in Saline County, well mounted and equipped for the journey. The spring was backward, and when I reached Colonel Chiles's house in the middle of April, winter was still lingering in the lap of spring. The grass was not good on the plains until the 10th of May. It was arranged for me to go out with the train commanded by Jim Crow, a son of Colonel Chiles. Jim Crow was then about 25, not over medium height, but strong, athletic, and wiry, and had a pretty well-established reputation as a fighter among the frontiersmen. He had killed a lawyer named Moore, who lived at Leavenworth, in the Nolan Hotel at Independence. After the Civil War, he killed 2 other men at Independence, and he himself was eventually killed in a fight with the Independence town marshal. But I found Jim Crow a kind and considerate friend, jovial and good-natured generally, but subject to violent fits of anger, and when angry, a very dangerous man. One night on the trail, while he and I were riding some distance ahead of the train, amid the solitude of the darkness and the vast plains, the conversation drifted into a confidential vein. He recalled the killing of Moore, saying he regretted it beyond measure, that the affair had haunted him day and night, that he would willingly give up all that he owned or expected to acquire to be relieved of the anguish and trouble and remorse the act had caused him. But he was possessed of the kind of courage and combativeness which never suggested the avoidance of a fight then or afterward. Kansas City was even then, in 1857, an aspiring town. For a month or two in the spring, the levee was covered with wagons and teams, and sometimes 4 or 5 steamboats were at the wharf discharging freight. General John W. Reed had recently bought 40 acres, the northwest corner of which is now the intersection of Broadway and 12th Street, for $2,000. The land was covered with timber, which he cut into cordwood and sold to the steamboats for about enough to pay for the land. There were no streets and only one road from the levee, leaving the riverfront at Grand Avenue, running obliquely across to Main Street and back again to Grand Avenue in McGee's addition. Colonel Milton McGee had taken down his fences and laid off his cornfields into lots. The work cattle and wagons were collected in a camp established about the 1st of May on the high rolling prairie near the Santa Fe Trail, 3 miles southwest of Westport. The wagons were heavy, cumbrous affairs with long, deep beds, covered with sheets of heavy cotton cloth supported by bows. A man 6 feet high could stand erect in one of them, and they were designed to hold a load of 7,000 or 8,000 pounds of merchandise each. Those in our train were made by Hiram Young, a free Negro at Independence, and they were considered as good as any except those with iron axles. The freight consisted of merchandise for the trade in New Mexico. 2 of the wagons were loaded with imported champagne for Colonel St. Vrain of Las Vegas and Mora. There was a shortage of good ox drivers that spring, and Captain Jim Crow found it difficult to supply the number he needed. $25 a month and found were the wages. One evening, while we were lounging around the corral, waiting for supper, 3 men came up on foot, inquiring for the captain of the train. They were good-looking, well-dressed men, 2 of them wearing silk hats, but bearing no resemblance to the ordinary ox driver. They said they were stranded and looking for work. They proposed to Captain Chiles to hire to him for drivers, while they disclaimed any knowledge of the calling. Jim Crow laughed, and after interrogating them as to their antecedents, said he would hire them on probation. "I will take you along," he said, "and if I find you, you can learn to drive cattle before we get to Council Grove, the last settlement on the road. Then I'll keep you. Otherwise not. You must look out for yourselves." They were invited to supper and assigned to a mess. One of them was named Whitcomb. He hailed from Massachusetts and had never seen a yoke of oxen in his life, but he was strong, sturdy, and active, and before we reached New Mexico, he was rated the most dexterous driver in the outfit. Moreover, his team looked better than any in the train when we reached the end of our journey. 10 years ago, Whitcomb was living in Cheyenne. He was one of the wealthiest cattle raisers in the state of Wyoming. Another of the 3 hailed from Cincinnati. He wore a threadbare suit of broadcloth and a plug hat, and was tall, angular, awkward, slipshod, and slouchy in appearance. He had been employed in his father's banking house in Cincinnati and was accomplished in penmanship and a good accountant, but he proved to be utterly unfit for an ox driver. He could not hold his own among his rough companions and became the object of their jeers and derision. By unanimous consent, he was given the name of Ski Six, and by this name he was known ever afterwards. The third of the trio proved to be a fairly good driver and is now a prosperous merchant in the state of Montana. Among the drivers was a young Mexican, Juan, who had been in the employ of the Chiles brothers for years. Through him, we were enabled to converse with the Kiowas and Comanches when we reached them. Many of the Indians could speak or understand Spanish, but could not understand a word of English. We had met among the teamsters from Tennessee, Kentucky, Arkansas, and Texas. They soon became known and answered to the name of their own state. Tennessee and Texas prided themselves on the size and weight of their whips and the loudness of the noise they could make in popping them. Young Reese from Missouri went out with the train for his health. He had consumption and hoped the journey over the plains would be of benefit to him. He was very tall, being 6 feet 4 inches, of large bone and frame, but thin as a huge skeleton, and had allowed his heavy black hair to grow until it hung below his shoulders. He was well off so far as property was concerned, and rode a splendid dapple gray horse, muscular, tough, and graceful, with handsome mane and tail, which could fairly fly over the prairie. End of chapter. Over the Santa Fe Trail by W.B. Napton. Narrated by Paul Beauheart. Chapter 2. In Camp, south of Westport. In the camp 3 miles southwest of Westport, we were detained for a fortnight or more, awaiting the arrival of our freight in Kansas City. There were 26 wagon, 5 yoke of oxen to each, carrying about 7,000 pounds of freight each. There were no tents, so we slept on the ground, either under a wagon or, if we preferred it, the broad canopy of heaven. Captain Jim Crow commanded the company, with Rice as assistant wagon master. There was one driver for each wagon and a boy of 16 of frontier origin and training, whose duty it was to drive the cavayard, or loose cattle, taken along in case any of the teams should get lame or unfit for service. Jim Crow, immediately on his arrival at the camp, gave the boy the nickname of Little Breeches, suggested by his very tight-fitting trousers, and the name, abbreviated to Little Breech, stuck to him. While in camp below Westport, I was fortunate in purchasing a first-rate buffalo horse, a California Lass horse, that had been brought across the plains the previous year. He proved his excellence afterward, was very fast, and run up so close to a buffalo that I could sometimes touch him with the pistol point. Camped in our vicinity were several corrals of trains belonging to Mexican merchants who used mules instead of oxen, and had lately come up from New Mexico. These Mexicans subsisted altogether on taus, unbolted flour, and dried buffalo meat, while our mess wagon was filled with side bacon, flour, coffee, sugar, beans, and pickles. I soon got on fair terms of acquaintance with the master of one of these Spanish trains. He was a successful buffalo hunter, but I was surprised to find he used a spear for killing them instead of a pistol. When a buffalo was found at a distance from the road or camp, he would goad the animal until so enraged it would turn upon and follow him. And in this manner he would get the game to a more convenient place for butchering before finally dispatching it. There were no farms fenced up in sight of our camp at that time, but the prairie was dotted with the houses of the squatter sovereigns who were holding down claims. On the 10th day of June, we yoked up and started on the long journey. At the outset, everybody about the train, from the captain to the cavayard driver, was filled with good humor. The weather was perfect, the view of the apparently boundless prairie exhilarating. The road, having been surveyed and established by the government before the country was at all occupied, was almost as straight as an arrow toward the southwest. The wagon master would arouse the men before daylight in the morning, and the cattle would be driven up to the corral, yoked up and hitched to the wagons by the time the cooks could prepare breakfast, a cook being assigned to each mess of 6 or 8 men. Some of the oxen were not well broken to the yoke, and it was a difficult task at the dim break of day for a green man to select each steer that belonged to his team in the corral, where the 250 were crowded together so that their sides would almost touch. Once on the road, the drive was continued for from 8 to 12 miles, the stops being governed by the convenience of camping places, where grass and water could be found for the cattle. Familiarity with the route was essential in the wagon master, who, riding some distance ahead, would select the camping place, and when the train came up, direct the formation of the corral. The cattle were immediately unyoked and turned loose, herded by 2 of the teamsters. Often it was necessary to drive the cattle a mile or more from the corral in order to find sufficient grass, that near the road being kept short by the incoming trains from Mexico and the outgoing trains ahead of us. At Council Grove there was a considerable settlement of Indian traders. There we found assembled a large band of Kiowa Indians, who had just reached there from a buffalo hunt on the Arkansas. The Kiowas were not classed as wild Indians, and I think had been assigned to a reservation not far off. But when they got off on a hunt, their native savage inclinations made them about as dangerous as those roaming the plains at will, in whose contact with the white man was much less frequent. Beyond the Diamond Spring, we met 2 men on horseback who were hunting cattle belonging to a train then corralled some distance ahead. The cattle had been stampeded by Indians in the night, and they had lost 50 head. The train could not be moved without them. The men had been in search of them for 2 days and thought they would be compelled to offer a reward for them, that being found necessary sometimes along the border. The Indians and squaw men, white men married to or living with Indian squaws, would stampede cattle at night, drive them off, and hold them until they ascertained that a reward had been offered for them. Then they would visit the corral, learn with seeming regret of the cause of the detention of the train, declare that they were well acquainted with the surrounding country and could probably find them and bring them in, offering to perform this service for so much a head. After the bargain was struck, the cattle would be delivered as soon as they could be driven from the place of their secretion. It was not infrequent for a band of Kaws to strike a wagon master in this way for as much as from $100 to $500. Here we learned that Colonel Albert Sidney Johnson, in command of a considerable force, had moved out from Fort Scott against the Cheyennes, who were on the warpath up on the Republican River in the western part of Kansas. But we missed seeing the command until months later, on our homeward journey in September. End of chapter. Over the Santa Fe Trail by W.B. Napton. Narrated by Paul Beauheart. Chapter 3. Buffalo. As we were drawing near the buffalo range, preparations were made for a chase. The pistols were freshly loaded and butcher knives sharpened. One morning, about 9 o'clock on Turkey Creek, a branch of the Cottonwood, we came in sight of buffalo in a great mass stretching out over the prairie as far as the eye could reach, though the topography of the country enabled us to see for several miles in each direction. The prairie in front of us was gradually undulating, but offered no great hindrance to fast riding. Reese and I were anxious to try our skill, and Captain Chiles said he would go along to assist in butchering and bringing up the meat. But as he was riding a mule, he could not be expected to take an active part in the chase. Reese was mounted on his splendid iron gray, and I on my trained buffalo horse, each of us having a pair of Colt's Navy revolvers of 6 chambers and holsters. We rode slowly until we got within 300 or 400 yards of the edge of the vast herd. Then they began to run, and we followed, gaining on them all the time. Pressing forward at the full speed of my horse, I discovered that the whole band just in front of me were old bulls. I was so anxious to kill a buffalo that I began shooting at a very large one, occasionally knocking tufts of hair off his coat, but apparently having little other effect. However, after a lively run of perhaps a mile or two, he slackened his pace, and at last stopped still and, turning about, faced me. I fired the 1 or 2 remaining charges of my revolvers at a distance of 20 or 30 yards, and thought he gave evidence of being mortally wounded. After gazing steadily at me for a few minutes, he turned around and walked off. I followed, but presently he resumed a gallop in the direction the main herd had gone, soon disappearing from view over a ridge. So I had made a failure, and felt a good deal put out, as well as worn out by the fatigue of fast riding. Through a vista between the clouds of dust raised by the buffalo, I got a glimpse of Reese. His horse proved to be very much afraid of the buffalo and could not be urged close enough to afford shooting with any degree of certainty with a pistol. Reese held his magnificent horse with a rein of the bridle in either hand, his head fronting towards the buffalo, but the frightened animal would turn to one side despite the best efforts of his master, fairly flying around in front of the herd. That was Reese's first and last attempt to kill a buffalo on horseback. I rode back towards the train, soon meeting Captain Chiles, who greeted me with derisive laughter, but considerably expressed the hope that I would have better success upon a second attempt. As we were all very anxious to get some fresh meat, he suggested that I should lend him my horse, that he would easily kill one with a double-barrel shotgun, which he was carrying in front on his saddle. I readily agreed to this, and mounting on my horse, he put off and promptly slew a flat, well-grown calf that proved good eating for us, who lived on bacon for many days. That afternoon I turned my buffalo horse loose, permitting him to follow or be driven along with the cavayard, in order that he might recuperate from the exhausting races of the forenoon. The following morning he was as good as ever, and I resolved to try another chase. Having received some pertinent instructions from Captain Chiles as to the modus operandi of killing buffalo on horseback at full speed, I mounted and sallied forth with him, the weather being ideal and the game abundant. At the left of the road in sight, thousands of buffalo were grazing in a vast plain, lower than the ridge down which we were riding. Opened up in our view was a scope of country to the southeast of us, a distance of 10 miles. This plain was covered with them, all heading towards the northwest. At the outset, I was more fortunate than on the previous day, for when I had gotten up close to them, I found in front of me cows and calves, young things of 1 or 2 years old. Singling out a fat young cow, distinguished by her glossy coat of hair, I forced my horse right up against her and brought her down at the second shot. I pulled rein, stopping my horse as suddenly as was possible at the breakneck speed at which he was going, and in another moment the herd had spread out, and I was completely surrounded by the rushing mass of animals which my attack had set in motion. The air was so clouded with dust that I could hardly see more than 20 yards from where I was standing, near the carcass of the cow I had killed. There was danger of being run over by them, but they separated as they approached, passing on either side of me a few yards distant. After a while, the rushing crowd thinned, and up rode Captain Chiles, exclaiming, "Why don't you kill another?" 50 yards from us, they were rushing by, all in the same direction. I again dashed into the midst of them, pressing my horse in pursuit of another young cow. She shot ahead of everything, increasing her speed so that I could hardly keep sight of her. While thus running at full speed, my horse struck a calf with his breast, knocking the calf down flat and almost throwing himself also. I pulled up as quickly as possible, turned around, and shot the prostrate calf before it could get up. So I had 2 dead in, say, 20 minutes. After this day's experience, I had no trouble in killing all the buffalo we needed for our own consumption. For a week or 10 days, they were hardly out of sight. We found them as far west as Pawnee Rock. All told, I killed about 20 on the journey out and back. A good steak cut from the loin of a buffalo cow, broiled on the coals with a thin slice of bacon attached to it to improve its flavor, was good eating, and I soon became an accomplished broiler. End of chapter. Over the Santa Fe Trail by W.B. Napton. Narrated by Paul Beauheart. Chapter 4. Companions of Voyage. Before reaching Pawnee Rock, we overtook a train of 30 wagons belonging to the leading freighters of the West, Majors, Russell, and Waddell, with which we traveled to Fort Union, their freight being consigned to that post. This train had 30 wagons built, I believe, in Philadelphia, with heavy iron axles and spindles, which seemed superior to any others I had seen on the prairies. Hagen was wagon master and Hines his assistant. The former was a sandy-haired man who rode a large bay mule, a drowsy animal with immense lop ears that moved back and forth as he walked. This ungainly mule, I found out in a day or two afterwards, had his good points. He could run as fast and get up as close to a buffalo as any horse in either outfit. Notwithstanding Hagen's generally uncouth appearance, he was a man of sterling worth and a capital hand at killing buffalo. Subsequently, we joined in many chases, and I found him an agreeable companion. On the rear end of each of the wagons in Hagen's train there was pasted a set of printed rules for the government of the employees in the service of Majors Russell and Waddell. Both liquor and profanity were absolutely prohibited, but of the strict enforcement of the rules I cannot speak. While riding in advance of the train in company with Captain Chiles, we saw our Mexican friend, whose acquaintance we had formed at Westport, the master of his own train, galloping toward us with a buffalo cow following close behind his horse. As was his habit, he had attacked the animal with his spear, stabbing her until she became infuriated so that she turned on him and was following him. It occurred to me she was pressing him a little too closely to be agreeable. We rode rapidly toward him, and as we were drawing near the cow, became so exhausted by loss of blood that she stopped still, when Captain Chiles rode up and gave her a broadside with his shotgun, which finished her. Whenever they found buffalo in plenty, the Mexicans would halt for several days and kill enough to supply their trainmen. They preserved the meat by cutting it into thin strips and hanging it on ropes about the corral until it was dried by the sun. But thus cured, it had a sour, disagreeable taste to me. The Mexicans would stew it with quantities of red pepper and devour it with great relish. As we approached the valley of the Little Arkansas, where the view of the country was more extensive than any we had yet seen, there was no limit to the herds of buffalo, the face of the earth being covered with them. We camped at noon at the crossing of the stream. The buffalo were crossing the creek above us, moving westward in bands of from 25 to 100 or more. At the crossing, they had a trail cut down through the steep banks of the stream 3 or 4 feet in depth. But I had enough of buffalo chasing, except when we were in need of fresh meat. It was too much like riding out into the pasture and killing your own domestic cattle. I found antelope hunting much better sport. After Walnut Creek, the next place of interest was Pawnee Rock, near which many battles between the traders and the Indians had taken place. This bluff, facing the road on the right-hand side at a distance perhaps of 100 yards, was of brown sandstone about 50 feet high, the bluff end of the ridge extending down to the river bottom. I climbed up the almost perpendicular face of the elevation, where I found many names cut in the soft stone, names of Santa Fe traders who had traveled the trail, among them that of Colonel M.M. Marmaduke, who crossed to Mexico as early as 1826 and was afterwards governor of Missouri, and James H. Lucas, a prominent and wealthy citizen of St. Louis. We were not particularly apprehensive of Indian troubles, although we knew the Cheyennes were turbulent. Elijah Chiles, a brother of our captain, had been loading goods at Kansas City when we left, a train of 26 wagons for the Kiowas and Comanches, and was doubtless a few days' drive behind us. But we kept on the lookout day and night. The guard around the cattle was doubled, and each teamster had a gun of some sort, which he kept strapped to the wagon bed, loaded and ready for service. End of chapter. Over the Santa Fe Trail by W.B. Napton. Narrated by Paul Beauheart. Chapter 5. Pestiferous Indians. All the while we knew the Indians could wipe us out if they were determined to do so. In both trains there were not above 60 men, while there were nearby warriors by the thousands. A day's journey beyond Pawnee Rock, we were visited by a hunting party of 15 or 20 young Kiowa bucks, the first real wild Indians we had seen. They did not seem the least wild, however, but uncomfortably tame, and disposed to get very familiar on short acquaintance. They were evidently out on a lark and disposed to make us the objects of their amusement that afternoon. They scattered up and down the length of both trains, talking and laughing with the teamsters. Two of them took particular fancy to my friend Reese, riding on either side of him, taking hold of his arms and seeming to admire his long hair and the handsome horse he rode. Reese was not at all afraid of them and permitted no undue interference with his person or property. Reese was no coward. While we were still in the dangerous region, he would ride for miles ahead of the train alone, dismount, and lie down to rest or sleep. When I said to him that he was incurring unnecessary risk of being killed by the Indians, he remarked that if they did kill him, they could not rob him of much in this world. Along where we were traveling at the time of the visit of the Kiowa bucks, the river bottom was as smooth as a billiard table. Hagen's train was in the lead of ours, a space of perhaps 30 yards intervening. Hagen and I were riding abreast at the rear of his train when suddenly two of the young bucks raised up a loud whoop and started their horses at full speed, taking a corner of their blankets in each hand and holding them above their heads so that they made a flapping sound in the air. They went sweeping along right against the cattle, almost instantly creating a stampede, the cattle turning out of the highway, making the big wagons rattle as they went. For an instant, Hagen sat on his mule's stock still, apparently dumbfounded. In another moment, he put spurs to his mule, intending to head the fleeing cattle. But instead of running, the mule suddenly bucked, throwing Hagen in his saddle also, the girth breaking, over his head and landing him in the road flat on his back. Hagen got up, pulled himself together, and rubbed the dust out of his eyes, but said nothing, though gifted in the way of eloquent profanity. No great harm resulted from the stampede. Some others of the party of Indians ran ahead and stopped the cattle. There was no collision of wagons and no damage, but the affair left an ugly feeling of resentment among the teamsters toward the Indians. The Indians laughed and talked about the affair among themselves. Any effort to punish them was out of the question, the entire tribes of Kiowas and Comanches being encamped within a day's journey above us. The Indians kept along with the train all of the afternoon. Observing my horse and accoutrements, they inquired through Juan, the Spaniard, if he was fleet and good for buffalo, and pressed me to go out with them for buffalo the next day. I would gladly have seen the Indians engage in a buffalo chase, but declined the invitation, making such excuses as I could without expressing any want of confidence as to their good fellowship. My scalp was intact, and I felt disposed to keep it so. The Kiowas begged Captain Chiles and Hagen to give them some flour and sugar, but they refused, knowing that a donation would be necessary later on, when we should meet the entire tribes of Kiowas and Comanches encamped above us, awaiting the arrival of their agent and the trainload of goods for them. Late in the evening, after we had corralled and the cooks were preparing to get supper, these Indians having ridden off in the direction of the river, two of them reappeared. They returned to the camp, each with a bundle of dry driftwood, picked up on the river bank, which they threw down near the campfire. This meant that they wanted supper, and Captain Chiles gave directions for the preparation of food for them. The Indians took supper with us, after which they departed, evidently feeling better and good-naturedly disposed toward us. The night there was much discussion of the Indian problem, with which we seemed now confronted. At noon the next day, as the cattle were being driven into the corral, another party of young warriors made their appearance at our camp and came near involving us in a serious conflict. The trouble was brought on by the impatient action of our assistant wagon master, Rice. 4 or 5 young fellows rode up into the rear entrance of our corral and were sitting there on their horses looking on at the yoking of the cattle. They partially blocked up the opening and interfered with egress of the teams. Rice, coming up behind them, without warning gave one of their horses a blow with a heavy black snake whip. The horse sprang forward, nearly unseating the rider who, as soon as he could gather up the reins of his bridle, turned upon Rice in a towering rage, jerked an arrow from its quiver and fixed it in his bow. Forcing his horse right upon Rice, the Indian punched him with the point of the arrow until he knocked his hat off his head. Rice made no effort to resist the affront and threatened assault, but kept backing out of the Indian's reach. I was standing nearby and seized my pistol, thinking that a fight was imminent. At the height of the excitement, Captain Chiles made his appearance and commanded peace, in manner and language that the Indians could understand, but it required some time and a deal of talk to get them quieted. They denounced Rice's conduct as an insult they were bound to resent, and declared they would kill Rice sooner or later. Captain Chiles, speaking through Juan, our Spaniard, told them that if they commenced killing, they would have to kill us all, for we were bound to stand together when it came to that. After a long wrangle, the Indian said he would be satisfied if allowed to give Rice a sound flogging with a whip, but Captain Chiles refused. Finally, the Indians seemed to recover their composure to some extent and rode off in the direction of the main camp. Somewhere thereabout in the river bottoms, I saw the ruins of an old adobe fort. Old Fort Atkinson, doubtless named for and established and built by the command of Colonel Henry Atkinson of the regular army, with whose military career I happened to be somewhat familiar. The remains of the old fort excited my interest, but I do not recollect to have seen the place mentioned by any of the numerous accounts that have been written of the Santa Fe Trail. The fort was probably built in 1829. At that time, a body of regular troops were sent out on the trail as a protection to the traders. Colonel Henry Atkinson was ordered west in 1818 and placed in command of the 9th Military Department, then comprising the entire country west of St. Louis, as well as Illinois and Wisconsin, with headquarters at Fort Bellefontaine near St. Louis. He was soon afterward advanced in rank to brigadier general and held the command at Jefferson Barracks until his death in 1842. The military post at Council Bluffs, Iowa, was established by Colonel Atkinson in 1819, when he and his troops were transported on the first steamboats ascending the Missouri River. He served with distinction in the Black Hawk War in command of the forces. End of chapter. Over the Santa Fe Trail by W.B. Napton, narrated by Paul Beauheart. Chapter 6, At the Kiowa Camp. The train had got underway the next morning when the lodges of the Kiowas loomed up in sight of us. The camp seemed to extend over territory a mile square. The Indians said the entire tribe was assembled there, chiefs, warriors, squaws, and papooses. Presently we could see them moving towards us, hundreds of them, on horseback and on foot, all sorts and sizes, men, women, and children, coming to take a view of the white man and his belongings as they passed. Soon we could see also the lodges of the Comanches, appearing about equal in number and covering a like extent of country. The two camps were a mile or more apart. It had been agreed between the wagon masters that we would not make the usual noonday halt that day, but would drive by the Indian camps and as far beyond as it was possible for the cattle to stand the travel. We had anticipated a great throng of Indians, and here they came by the hundreds. Some of the big men among them had guns or pistols, but the greater number, in fact almost everyone, had a bow and quiver of arrows slung over his shoulders, even the children who looked not over 10 years old. One chief wore a complete outfit of blue with the insignia of a captain of the United States Army and had a Colt's revolver, but nearly all of them were naked to the waist with a breech clout and a sort of kilt of buckskin around the loins, hanging down nearly to the knees. Some wore moccasins, while many were barefooted. The little fellows, nude save for a breechclout, had little bows about a foot long with arrows of cactus thorn, with which they would shoot grasshoppers and other insects, showing astonishing skill. Numbers of the warriors carried spears with long handles, glittering in the sunlight as they rode along, giving the caravan the appearance of a vast army of crusaders on the march to the Holy Land. Captain Chiles, endeavoring to shift the responsibility and escape the annoyance of the Indians, pointed to Reese on his fine horse and said, "There's the captain. Talk to him. Ask him for what you want." But they cannot be so easily deceived. It is said that you cannot fool Indians in this particular, that they never fail to distinguish the wagon master and appear to select the chief of any crowd or caravan intuitively. As we were traveling along, the Indians gave frequent exhibitions of the speed of their horses, running races with each other, but at a sufficient distance not to frighten or stampede our cattle. The younger men kept up a continual chattering and laughing. Horse racing seemed their great amusement. The young fellows of the visit renewed their invitation, urging me to join them in a buffalo chase, explaining that the herds were not far off, and expressing a great desire to see a trial of my buffalo horse in a chase with theirs. I again declined. The train was continually moving and would not be stopped to suit my convenience, and there were other reasons, not unreasonably discreet. The headmen of the tribes, addressing the wagon masters, complained that they were in great need of supplies, owing to the delay in the arrival of their annuities, and asked a gift from the two trains. The two wagon masters, after some demurring, proposed to them that if they, with all their people, would withdraw from and cease to follow the train and desist from annoying us after we had corralled, we would go into camp and give them such supplies as we could spare. To this proposition the chiefs agreed. One of the leaders began talking in a loud voice to the multitude, gradually riding off from us, the crowd following. Reaching a knoll which elevated him so that he could overlook them, he dismounted and proceeded to make a speech. They seemed a little slow about leaving, the multitude appearing to be not altogether governed by the leaders, but nearly all finally withdrew in the direction of their own camp. Driving on a few hundred yards further, our corrals were formed and the cattle were driven off some distance for water, while preparations were made for cooking dinner. In a little while, the chiefs, representing both tribes, made their appearance at our corral, where the wagon masters of both trains had met to hold the diplomatic conference to determine how much of a gift of supplies they're expecting from us. The Indian chiefs dismounted from their horses, walked into the corral, and sat down on the ground in a semicircle, to the number of perhaps a dozen, and were soon joined by the wagon masters, together with our interpreter, Juan. Writing now in the year 1901, solely from memory, 43 years since the scene occurred, I am unable to recollect all that was said, or the names of any of the Indians who were present and took part in this parley. No doubt Santana, that famous Kiowa chief, was among them, but I took no notes whatever of this journey, and am forced now to rely entirely on my memory. I recall that it was stated that one of the most influential of the Comanche chiefs who was there was an out-and-out Spaniard or Mexican speaking the Indian language as well as anybody, and was generally known and recognized as among the meanest, most cruel, and bloodthirsty of the Comanche tribe. One of the elder-looking Indians produced a big pipe, filled it with tobacco, lighted it, and after taking a few puffs himself passed it to the one next to him. Thus the pipe was passed round to each one in the circle until all had taken part in the smoke. The Indians were dignified, discreet, and cautious, as appeared to me during the conference, leaving the impression that our troubles with them were about to terminate. This proved to be the fact. At the close, and as a result of the council, a half-dozen sacks of flour, half that many sacks of sugar, and a lot of sides of bacon were brought forth from the mess wagons and stacked up on the ground, near where the collection of dignitaries of the prairies were sitting, smoking the pipe of peace and good fellowship. I thought the Indians regarded the things we were giving them as a sort of tribute we were under obligations to pay for the privilege of passing through their country unmolested. Pack mules were brought up, the supplies were loaded on them, and they departed in the direction of the general camp, those engaged in the conference soon following. In the evening, before we broke camp, 2 young bucks came galloping into the camp. Addressing Captain Chiles, they said that by instruction of their chief, they had come to return a pair of blankets that had been stolen by one of the tribe. They threw down the blankets, and the captain called to the men at the mess wagon to give them a cup of sugar each, saying that it was the first instance in his life when an Indian had restored stolen property. End of chapter. Over the Santa Fe Trail by W.B. Napton. Narrated by Paul Beauheart. Chapter 7. To the Cimarron. Escaping any further delay from Indians or from other causes, good headway was made by the trains up the Arkansas until we reached the lower crossing. It had been determined by the wagon masters that we would cross the river here, taking the Cimarron route. Although the river was fordable, yet it was quite tedious and difficult to get the heavily loaded wagons across the stream, the water being waist steep and the bottom uneven. Neither an ox nor a mule will pull when he gets into water touching his body. The mule, under such circumstances, always has a tendency to fall down and so get drowned by becoming entangled in the harness. To meet this emergency, the ox teams were doubled, 10 yoke being hitched to each wagon, and were urged to do their duty by a half-dozen drivers on each side, wading through the water beside them. The greater part of one day was taken up in getting the wagons across, but it was accomplished without serious loss. Everything being over, we encamped at the foot of the hill on the opposite side and rested a day in recognition of the 4th of July. We fired some shots, and Captain Chiles brought forth from his trunk some jars of gooseberries, directing the cooks to make some pies as an additional recognition of the national holiday. The gooseberries were all right, but the pie crust would have given an ostrich a case of indigestion. The old Santa Fe Trail from the lower crossing of the Arkansas ran southwest to the Cimarron, across a stretch of country where there was no water for a distance of nearly 60 miles, if my memory serves me correctly. All the water casks were filled from the Arkansas River for the use of the men, but of course there was no means of carrying water for horse or ox. The weather was warm and dry, and now we were about to enter upon the jornada, the Spanish word for dry stretch. Intending to drive all night, starting was postponed until near sundown, 2 or 3 miles from the Arkansas, we apparently reached the general altitude of the plains over which we trudged during the whole night, with nothing but the rumbling of the wagons and the occasional shout of one of the drivers to break the silence of the plain. It was my first experience of traveling at night on this journey. Toward midnight I became so sleepy that I could hardly sit on my horse, so dismounting, I walked and led him. Advancing to a point near the head of the trains, I ventured to lie down on the ground to rest, as the trains were passing at least. Instantly, my clothes were perforated with cactus needles, which pricked me severely, waking me thoroughly. In the darkness, it was with great difficulty I could get the needles out. Mounting my horse again, I rode some distance in advance of everybody, completely out of hearing of the trains, and riding thus alone, with nothing visible but the stars. A feeling of melancholy seized me, together with a sense of homesickness, with which I had not hitherto been troubled. Each day's travel was increasing the distance between me, my home, and my mother, to whom I was most dearly attached, and here, amid the solitude, darkness, and perfect quietude of the vast plains, I began to reflect upon the dangers besetting me, and the uncertainty of ever returning to my home or seeing my relatives again. The approach of morning and the rising of the sun soon dispelled these forebodings of evil and revived my spirits. Old Sol, like a ball of fire, emerged from the endless plain to the east of us, as from the ocean, soon overwhelming us with a flood of light such as I had never experienced before. During all that day's march, the heat was intense and the sunlight almost blinding, the kind of weather that creates the mirage of the plains. In the distance, on either hand, fine lakes of clear water were seen glistening in the sun, sometimes appearing circular in shape, surrounded with the proper shores, the illusion being apparently complete, so much so that several times during the day I rode some distance seeking to ascertain if they were really lakes or not. I found them receding as I approached, and was unable to get any closer to them than when, as a boy, I set out to find the sack of gold at the end of the rainbow. About midday, we passed a great pile of bleached bones of mules that had been thrown up in a conical-shaped heap by the passing trainmen. In the course of the 10 years they had been lying there. They were the remains of 200 or 300 mules belonging to John S. Jones, a Missourian, a citizen of Pettis County, whom I knew personally. In 1847, and for many years afterward, Jones was engaged in freighting across the plains. In 47, having obtained a contract from the government to transport freight for the troops at Santa Fe, he got a start late in the season and had only reached the crossing of the Arkansas when he was overtaken by such deep snow and severely cold weather as to compel him to stop and to go into quasi-winter quarters. While there, protected by such barracks for man and beast as could be hastily constructed, he received orders from the commander of the troops in New Mexico that he must hurry up with the supplies, orders of such urgency that they could not be disregarded. He had a mule train of 30 wagons. Orders were given to hitch up and start. The weather moderated the first day, but on the second they encountered a heavy and cold rain, freezing as it fell, and were forced to go into corral. Intense cold followed, and every one of the mules froze to death, huddling in the corral during the night. Years afterwards, through the influence of Colonel Benton in the Senate and John G. Miller of Missouri in the House of Representatives, an appropriation was made by Congress of $40,000 to pay Mr. Jones for the loss of his mules. In the forenoon of the second day from the Arkansas, we reached Sand Creek, a tributary of the Cimarron, where we found a pool of stagnant water, not enough for the oxen, but sufficient for the trainmen to make coffee with. And there we camped. A few hours afterwards, we struck the valley of the Cimarron, and after riding up the bed of the apparently dry stream, we discovered a pool of clear water. The cattle were so famished that they ran into it, hitched to the wagons, their drivers being unable to restrain them, and it was with considerable difficulty that the wagons were afterwards pulled out of the mud. End of chapter. Chapter 8, My First Antelope. After reaching the Cimarron, we began seeing herds of antelope in the distance. At first I tried flagging them. I'd been told that on approaching within 200 or 300 yards of them, concealed from their view behind an intervening ridge, these animals were possessed of such inordinate curiosity that they could be enticed to within gunshot of the hunter by tying a handkerchief on the end of a stick and elevating it in sight of the antelope, the hunter, of course, keeping concealed. I made several efforts at this plan of exciting their curiosity, and while some of them came toward me at first sight of the flag, their curiosity seemed counterbalanced by caution or incredulity, and in no instance could I get one to come near enough for a sure or safe shot. I then tried a rifle, with which I was also unsuccessful, not then being able to make a correct estimate of the distance between me and the antelope, a troublesome task, only to be acquired by experience and constant practice. The old trail ran along up the valley of the Cimarron several days' drive. A singular stream was the Cimarron. For the most part of the bed of the stream was sand, perfectly dry, but now and then, every mile or two, we found a hole of clear good water, except that it was slightly tinctured with alkali, a brackish but not unpleasant taste. There were 3 fairly good springs along the road near the Cimarron, designated as the lower, middle, and upper spring, and we camped near each of them as we passed. As we traveled up the valley, squads of antelope could be seen viewing the train from the heights on either side of the valley. Captain Chiles had along with him 2 shotguns, the smaller he had been using on buffalo, the other, an unusually large double-barrel No. 8 bore, very long in barrel and heavy, carrying easily 20 buckshot in each barrel. Armed with that big gun, I would ride in the direction of the antelope, but at an angle indicating that I would pass them. Usually when I had gotten within 300 or 400 yards of them, they would quietly withdraw from view behind the ridge, whereat I would turn the course of my horse and gallop as fast as I could, keeping the ridge between them and me until I had gotten within a short distance of the point of their disappearance. Then, dismounting, I hastily followed them on foot. Often they would be found to have moved not out of the range of that big gun, and with it I killed many of them. It was the only plan of killing antelope by which I gained success. During this part of the journey we saw many wolves, and of many varieties, from the little coyote to the great gray wolf. They were all very shy, however, and difficult to approach within gunshot. On the Cimarron, we were overtaken by the mail coach, one of the monthly lines that operated by Waldo and Company of Independence, Missouri. The coach had left Westport 5 days later than our train. The driver, guards, and passengers were all loaded to the guards, to use a steamboat phrase, with guns and pistols. While the train was under headway one morning, Captain Chiles rode along the length of the train inquiring for Ski-Six. But Ski-Six did not answer. No one could tell anything about him. The captain ordered the train stopped and a search to be made of each wagon, but the searchers failed to find any sign of Ski-Six. Further inquiry developed the fact that he had started out as one of the guards at midnight to protect the herd of cattle, they being off a mile or more from the corral where grass was found, and no one had seen him since. Captain Chiles declared that he could not afford to stop for so worthless a fellow as Ski-Six, and thereupon the orders were given for the train to proceed. Having traveled 10 or 12 miles, a camp was located at the foot of a mound which overlooked the road we had been traveling for nearly the whole distance of the morning's drive. At dinner, the propriety of laying by for a day or two, or long enough to make a proper search for a lost comrade, was discussed. But the teamsters all realized that no captain of a ship at sea ever wielded more absolute authority than Captain Chiles. He could brook no opposition and little criticism of his course or conduct. Any disobedience of his orders he regarded as equal to mutiny and was punished accordingly. About the entire camp a sullen silence prevailed. Suddenly, someone cried out that an object could be seen away down the road that might be Skeesix, but just then no one could discern whether a man or a horse or an Indian. The entire party assembled outside the corral to watch the approaching object, and after a while our lost Skeesix walked up, covered with dust and worn out with fatigue of constant walking for over 12 hours without food or water. He was soon revived by a comforting dinner. He said he had been aroused at midnight from a sound sleep to assume his turn as cattle guard, and on his way from the corral to the herd, he had wandered apart from his companion guard, soon becoming bewildered and completely lost. He wandered about during the entire night, not knowing in what direction he was going, and was all the while afraid to stop for fear of the wolves that were howling around him continually. After daylight, he accidentally found the road, and although bewildered, he had sense enough remaining to follow it to the west, whence he had overtaken us. As the cattle were being yoked, Captain Chiles called up Little Breech and directed him to get the large cowbell he had brought along to put on the black steer that was in the habit of wandering from the herd at night. The wagon master, with the bell in hand, walked up to Skeesix, who was sitting on a wagon tongue, resting his weary legs, and said, "Skeesix, I am determined not to lose you again, and I'm going to take no chances." Then he buckled the strap attached to the bell around Skeesix's neck. Turning to Little Breech, he gave him particular orders to drive Skeesix in the cavayard and in no event to allow him to wander away again. All that afternoon, Skeesix plodded along with the lame cavil in the cavayard at the rear of the train, the bell ringing at every step. In the evening, after we had corralled, he went to Captain Chiles and plaintively beseeched him to remove the bell. The captain gently unbuckled the strap, but again charged Little Breech to keep his eye on Skeesix and not permit him to wander from the train. End of chapter. Over the Santa Fe Trail by W.B. Napton, narrated by Paul Beauheart. Chapter 9. A kicking gun and a bucking mule. Here for some days we were traversing a continuous level plain, treeless and trackless, except for the road we traveled covered with buffalo grass, then turned a beautiful straw color by the sun and dry weather, but still affording excellent pasturage. Not a tree had we seen, none since we crossed the Arkansas. We were slowly but regularly leaving behind us the monotonous plain to enter upon a region of great natural beauty and attractiveness. On a beautiful morning after the train had been moving for a short time, the rabbit ear mounds were seen, peering up in the distance through the hazy atmosphere. Yet we were a day's journey from them. These twin diminutive sentinels of the Rockies, stationed here to the left of our road, could not have been more appropriately named, the resemblance to the ears of a jackrabbit being strikingly obvious. A day or two after passing the rabbit ears, we were fortunate in the beauty and attractiveness of the location of our corral. Immediately west of us, the view was limited to a mile or two, shut off by the bluff rim of a stretch of tableland rising perhaps 100 feet above our level, the face of the elevation extending north and south, the road we were traveling passing around the base of its southern extremity. About midway of the rim of this plateau of tableland there was a small mound of regular sugarloaf shape, rising to perhaps the height of 20 feet, on the top pinnacle of which stood a single buck antelope looking at the train as it was starting out just at sunrise. There he stood for some time, stock-still gazing at us. The morning was absolutely glorious, the perfect weather of New Mexico. I determined to give this solitary buck antelope a trial. Procuring the big double-barreled shotgun belonging to Captain Chiles, I mounted my horse, riding in almost the opposite direction to that in which the train was moving. The buck held his position until I had ridden nearly opposite him, my course leaving him nearly half a mile to the left, when he suddenly retired behind the mound. Immediately turning my horse, I galloped over the ascending ground until I got within 100 yards of the base of the mound, dismounted quickly, walked rapidly up to it, then I crawled as quietly as possible nearly to the top. Peeping around so as to get a view of the opposite side, I beheld 40 yards from me that fine buck, looking intently toward me, with 4 or 5 of his companions lying down near him, so close together that I could almost have covered them all with the big shotgun. Holding the gun in the right hand, it was so heavy that I could scarcely handle it. Cocking both barrels, I pushed it out in front of me, and just as I was in the act of placing the breech of the gun against my shoulder, but before I had gotten it fairly in place, off it went, both barrels simultaneously, sounding like a cannon, and kicking me with such force as to turn me over and over, rolling me down nearly to the foot of the mound. The gun struck my face, bruising it badly, making my nose bleed profusely and stunning me. But not so badly but that I noticed the bunch of fine antelopes scampering off, frightened but untouched. My horse stood quietly where I left him picketed. Our real character, Little Breeches, antedated the potential child of the fancy of Colonel John Hay, introduced to the public some 30 years ago. Whether this distinguished gentleman had any knowledge of our caviar driver, I do not know, but in truth the two Little Breeches had similar characteristics, both chawing tobacco at an early age, and our Little Breeches had the additional accomplishment of swearing with emphasis and articulation unexcelled or unequaled by any of the older and more hardened bullwhackers of our train. Little Breech rode a pony mule, a small animal of most perfect shape, with activity to correspond. The noonday camp was breaking up. The cattle were all yoked and hitched to the wagons. Little Breech had mounted his mule, preparing to round up his caviar. At the moment the reins were lying loose on the mule's neck, while Little Breech had both hands employed in adjusting his belt. Impulse dictated so, walking towards him unobserved, I picked up a stick, raised the mule's tail, and gently placed the stick under it. The mule instantly clasped it tight with his tail, commencing before Little Breech could seize the bridle reins, the worst spell of bucking I had witnessed on the journey. He jumped and kicked and jumped for 100 yards, describing a semicircle in his gyrations. I was alarmed, fearing the boy's neck would surely be broken. But failing to get a hold of the bridle reins, he clamped the horn of the Spanish saddle, and retaining his seat to the end, all the while swearing at me with as great force as he could command, his volubility being very much restricted by the prolonged bucking. End of chapter. If you are enjoying this reading from Friendly Frog Press, please make sure to subscribe and hit that like button. If you'd like to purchase a copy of this book, it is available on Amazon in eBook and paperback, and it is available on Audible as an audiobook. The links are in the description below, or you can check out friendlyfrogpress.com for purchasing options. Over the Santa Fe Trail by W.B. Napton, narrated by Paul Beauheart, Chapter 10, A Gray Wolf. It is difficult, if not impossible, to find the derivation of some of the Spanish or Mexican words and phrases then in use by the Santa Fe traders. For instance, the word caviar I've used and spelled it as it was pronounced by these unlettered plainsmen, and is applied by them to the bunch of loose cattle and horses driven behind the train. The pure Castilian has undoubtedly suffered many changes in New Mexico, among the lower classes particularly. The Spanish words used by these plainsmen had been both Mexicanized and then Missourianized until so changed and corrupted as to be hardly recognizable at all. The word caviar, they declared, was of Spanish origin. If so, it must have been a corruption of cabala, pronounced cavalier, meaning an attendant on horses. The derivation of the word jornada, which we found given to the dry stretch between the Arkansas and Cimarron, is equally obscure. Among the teamsters was a Mexican whose name I have forgotten. One morning, Captain Chiles got up earlier than usual, at break of day, in fact, and while waking up the men, he discovered this Mexican beating one of his oxen severely with bow of the ox bow. This was a gross violation of the rules, but when Captain Chiles censured him in pretty strong language, he talked back to him in a threatening manner. Thereupon the captain, drawing one of the 2 Navy pistols swinging to a belt around his waist, holding it in one hand and with a heavy black snake whip in the other, advanced upon him and proceeded to give him a severe flogging with the whip. The Mexican was held fast by the threatening aspects of the Navy pistol pointed at him, all the while until he had received a very severe flogging. The following night the Mexican skipped out and was never seen by us afterwards, but no doubt made his way to the settlements of New Mexico, then not more than 200 miles distant. Hunting game, other than buffalo, along the Santa Fe Trail at that date was to one attached to a train independent upon its movements, necessarily confined to a narrow scope of country on either side of the road, within a mile or two. It was impossible to know at what moment one might meet with Indians and be attacked by them. At that time of the year, the game was kept back from the highway by the frequent passage of trains, while a few miles off from the road, there was no trouble to find antelope and white-tailed deer. I was compelled to hunt alone or not at all. My friend Reese had become too much worn out by the travel and his continued ill health to make much interest in hunting, while Captain Chiles was kept busy with his duties about the train. But I was continually on the lookout for game. I rarely traveled the road, but would ride a mile or so from it on one side or the other, always carrying my holster pistols, and usually, in addition, the big shotgun belonging to Captain Chiles. My buffalo horse seemed to have a very clear understanding of travel over the plains, having, as before stated, the experience of a journey from California to Missouri the previous year. He seemed to have an instinctive idea of the locality of the train even when it was traveling, and often when riding him a mile or more from the road and completely out of sight. When given the rein, he would instantly change his course in the proper direction to intercept the train. Riding thus alone on one occasion, some distance ahead of the train, I saw a large gray wolf galloping across my course, going towards the road. I determined to give him a chase, and after him I went. The wolf increased his speed, and, urging my horse to his best, we went flying across the road 100 yards in front of the train and in full view of it. As we flew by, the entire company of teamsters gave us an encouraging whoop, but whether designed for me or the wolf, I was not able to determine. I had followed the big fellow closely for a mile, emptying at him, if not in him, the entire 12 chambers of my revolvers. At one time I got within 20 feet of him, but not having any ammunition for reloading with me, nor time for recharging my pistols if I had, he disappeared over the ridge and I saw nothing more of him. Many days passed, and many weary miles were traveled, of which I have no remembrance whatever, and I am only attempting to relate such adventures as were indelibly impressed upon my memory, the frost of 43 winters having passed over my head since this journey was made. I cannot recollect what I thought of the probability of those vast plains ever being occupied or cultivated as homes for white people. Whetstone Creek, which the road crossed near the boundary of New Mexico, was one of the localities of special interest to me. Back on my father's farm in Missouri, I had often whetted my pocket knife on a stone belonging to my old overseer friend, who said he had obtained it on this creek. But none of our trainmen were familiar with the route or the locality, or could tell me where the whetstone quarry was to be found, and I was disappointed in not being able to discover it after making a diligent search for it. And now the spurs of the Raton Mountains loomed up in the distance ahead of us, a novel and interesting sight to many of the company, some of whom had never seen any greater elevation than the big hills of western Missouri, and the drivers swore and cracked their whips with renewed vigor and animation. End of chapter. Over the Santa Fe Trail by W.B. Napton, narrated by Paul Beauheart, Chapter 11, Arrival at Las Vegas. Crossing the Okata on the dry bed of it, we were approaching Apache Hill on the branch of the road leading to Fort Union, the ascent of which was quite difficult due to heavily loaded wagons. The hill was barely visible in the distance, and the hour nearly noon when we first came in sight of it. It was quite hot under the noonday sun, and we could see the white sheets of a train of wagons descending the hill. Soon afterwards, Captain Chiles and I, riding ahead of our train, met the wagon master of this train, a sandy-haired, red-faced fellow, sullen, morose, and non-communicative. He seemed inclined to pass us without speaking, but Captain Chiles saluted him, and he halted for a few moments. The man appeared to be sick, and as Captain Chiles afterwards said, he could scarcely pull a word out of him with a log chain. The captain asked him, "How is the grass about the foot of Apache Hill?" When he answered, "Well, sir, it's damn scase." 10 miles before reaching Fort Union, we stopped at a ranch where we found an abundance of good milk and butter, kept in a well-arranged spring house supplied with water by a cold and bold spring running out of the foot of the mountain. The milk was kept in large open tin pans set in a ditch extending around the room, constructed so as to allow a continual flow of cool water about the pans. The spring house was built of adobe or sod bricks. This ranch supplied the fort with milk and butter. Fort Union had no appearance of a fortified place then. There was nothing more than substantial and comfortable barracks, stores, and warehouses. But the place had a look of military precision, neatness, and cleanliness about it not seen elsewhere in New Mexico. At this place our train was cut in twain. One half of it, under the command of Captain Chiles, went on to Mora. The other half was sent to Las Vegas in charge of the assistant wagon master Rice. Reese and I decided to accompany that part going to Las Vegas. On the route to Las Vegas, we found a large adobe ranch house, probably 100 feet square and 16 feet high, the solid walls being without openings on the outside except 2 large doors. The ventilation and light were secured through the openings inside the hollow square. There was an extensive buckskin tailoring establishment there, where they were manufacturing quantities of buckskin clothes of various patterns, and I was surprised at the skill displayed in making the garments. The clothes were made to fit with tailor-like precision and exactness. Clothes of buckskin were generally worn at that time by the inhabitants of New Mexico, by the natives especially. As we drew near Las Vegas, we noted that the bottoms of the little creek running near the town were cultivated in corn, with occasional patches of vegetables, the land unenclosed by fences, but flanked by irrigating ditches supplying the necessary water, and the crops were looking remarkably well, although the weather had been dry for some weeks. We found it necessary to have a close watch kept on our cattle while we were near these cultivated and unfenced fields. Las Vegas was a compactly built little town of probably 200 or 300 inhabitants. The houses, for the most part, built of adobe bricks or tufts of sod with a corral in the rear. The herds of sheep, goats, and burros were driven in about sunset and fastened up for the night in these corrals, from which they were driven out early in the morning to graze during the day, under the constant eye of the herder, who accompanied each band. We remained one day only at Las Vegas. The wagons were unloaded, the freight being delivered to the consignees, and we turned about and started on our homeward journey. While at Las Vegas, Reese purchased 3 goats, thinking that their milk would be beneficial to him. They furnished a bountiful supply of milk, and very rich milk it was too, though of a rather strong and disagreeable taste and odor. He failed, however, to realize any great benefit from its use, so far as I remember. Our first noonday camp after we left Las Vegas was near a ranch, and as we were resting under the shade of the wagons after dinner, the owner of the ranch, a native New Mexican, visited us with a good-looking shepherd dog following him. Reese expressed admiration for this dog, which, the Mexican declared, was excellently well trained for herding, easily controlled, and a valuable animal in other respects. After considerable negotiation, the Mexican agreed to sell the dog to Reese for 2 plugs of tobacco. Reese procured a rope, and the Mexican tied the dog to the rear axle of one of the freight wagons, soon afterward taking his departure for his ranch a mile or more distant. Shortly, the dog became restless and made efforts to get loose. The teamsters began to laugh at Reese about the uncertain character of his newly acquired property, saying that the Mexican well knew that he could not keep the dog and that he would soon make his escape to return home. Reese declared that he would prevent this at least, and went to a wagon and brought forth a gun. Standing the gun against the wagon under which the dog was fastened, Reese resumed his efforts to enjoy a noonday siesta under a neighboring wagon. He was aroused by one of the drivers, who shouted at him that his dog was running off in the direction of his home. The dog had gotten 200 or 300 yards away, ascending a ridge in a gallop, when Reese jumped up, seized the gun, leveled it at the dog, and fired. To his surprise, no less than ours, the dog fell dead. We rejoined the other part of the train at a camp near Fort Union, and here in this camp we remained for several days. Captain Chiles was desirous of selling a part of the cattle, as the whole were not needed to convey the empty wagons on their return journey. He made frequent visits to the fort in his efforts to dispose of the cattle. One evening he announced that he had made a sale of about 1/2 of the cattle. The following morning, a prosperous-looking gentleman of consequential air and mien rode up to our camp and was introduced as the purchaser of our cattle. He was riding a fine horse with saddle and other equipment to correspond. Among his other attractive features, I can recollect a large flask of brandy which he carried lashed to the front of his saddle, the flask being protected by a wicker jacket. Generous gentleman as he proved, the first thing he said after the usual salutation was an invitation to sample the contents of this flask. In this invitation, the common politeness of the plains prevented us from declining. We found his brandy excellent, and its effect produced a lasting remembrance of the personality of the gentleman himself. The cattle purchased by him were cut out and separated from the others. The owner said he intended driving them to some point in New Mexico, a considerable distance from there. On inquiring for some hands whom he could employ to drive them to their destination, one or two were found in the party who would accept the service offered, and then someone suggested that a job of this sort would suit Ski Six, who was still hanging to the train. Ski Six, with apparent reluctance, accepted the service and wages offered, and in a few moments afterwards left us forever. I could not avoid feeling sorry for him as he slowly passed from our view, trudging along on foot behind the herd of cattle. We never heard of him afterwards. While at this camp, a Mexican youth, about 16 years of age, came to the train and asked permission to accompany us to the States. He was a bright, active boy, able to understand and speak English in some degree, appearing immensely pleased when Captain Chiles told him that he might come along with us if he desired. During the night, some of the trainmen ascertained that he was a peon, consequently having no right to leave the territory. When the train started the next morning, at the suggestion of the men, he secreted himself in one of the covered wagons. Before noon, however, 2 horsemen were seen following us, coming on in a fast gallop. They were officers of the law, armed with pistols and a writ for the arrest of the boy. The trainmen pretended to be ignorant of his presence with the train, but the officers said they knew he was with the train, demanding of Captain Chiles that he stop the train so they might search for him. In order to avoid being subjected to the charge of resisting the officers, the captain ordered a halt. The officers soon discovered the boy concealed beneath some bedding, dragged him out, and put him on one of their horses. The poor boy protested with all his might against being taken back, crying all the while in a distressing manner, arousing the feelings of the trainmen until they were about to declare war on the officers. But Captain Chiles said it would not do to resist the civil authorities. So the little fellow was carried back to his condition of slavery or peonage, as it was called by the officers. At noon that day, our camp was near the base of a mound of broken rock, perhaps 100 feet high, rounded to a sharp pinnacle at its apex. The mound supported hardly a bit of vegetation on its sides, which were nearly inaccessible. The goats purchased by Reese had been driven along in the cavayard, apparently reconciled to their new mode of life and daily travel. That day, as the wagons were moving out of corral, Reese missed his goats. I joined him in a search for them, riding about over the plain, and we had about reached the conclusion that they had run away. Just then, as the wagons were moving from the corral, one of the teamsters shouted to Reese, "There are your goats!" pointing to the summit of this steep mound of rock. Sure enough, there were the 3 goats, standing in a row on the topmost rock, looking at us with the utmost satisfaction and composure. Nothing but a goat could either ascend or descend the declivity, so Reese and I remained until they thought proper to come down. This they did in the course of an hour, when we drove them on, overtaking the train as it went into camp at nightfall. End of chapter. Over the Santa Fe Trail by W.B. Napton, narrated by Paul Beauheart. Chapter 12. In Peril of Indians. The return journey was, for the most part, uneventful, but with empty wagons we could travel more rapidly. On our reaching the crossing of the Arkansas, we found there a company of dragoons, and the officers informed us that they had been fighting and chasing the Cheyennes all summer, having just halted there and following one band of these Indians to the Arkansas River. They had been forced to abandon their provision wagons some days before we saw them, and were almost entirely out of food. The artillery had also been left behind 2 or 3 days' march down the Arkansas River. These troops, a part of Colonel Sumner's regiment, had had several brushes with the Cheyennes and captured a lot of horses from the Indians. The soldiers, their horses, and equipments gave every evidence of having undergone a severe campaign, and they came around our camp begging for something to eat, tobacco, and whiskey, much as the Indians were in the habit of doing. But our ability to relieve their wants was very limited, having with us only supplies enough for our own party back to the settlements. The officer said that it would be hazardous for us to proceed further, advising our captain to remain until the trains in our rear could get up, until they had accumulated to at least 100 wagons and men, when we would be strong enough to resist any attack that we were likely to be subjected to. Acting on this advice, we remained in camp several days until 5 or 6 trains had arrived and camped in our immediate vicinity. The journey was then resumed, our train taking the lead, all our weapons of defense being put in as good order as possible. After the trains were underway, the wagon masters of those behind us, to the number of 10 or a dozen, mounted on horses and mules, would ride ahead to join Captain Chiles, Reese, and myself, thus forming a lively and agreeable company of companionable men. As we were thus riding along down the level bottom of the Arkansas, some distance in advance of the trains away to our right, a mile or more, out near the bank of the river where we could see some scattering cottonwood trees, we observed a smoke rising from a campfire. Someone of the party suggested that it was the smoke of the camp of the artillery company, of which we had been told, so we rode forward, giving little more attention to the smoke of the campfire that went curling upward among the cottonwood. When we had reached a point about opposite the smoke, there suddenly appeared in our view a company of some 50 horsemen, riding pell-mell in a fast gallop towards us. They were yet too far off to be distinctly seen or for us to tell what manner of men they were. In another moment Captain Chiles exclaimed, "Men, they are Indians! Soldiers don't ride in that disorderly manner. Form a line and get out your guns. We are in for it!" Instantly all hands obeyed his command, forming a line, facing the enemy, each of us drawing a pistol. The lead wagons of our train were just barely visible, probably 2 miles from us. When the approaching horsemen saw that we had formed a line of battle, they instantly drew rein, slackening their speed to a walk, but kept steadily drawing nearer us. In a few minutes our anxiety was relieved when these horsemen came near enough for us to see that they were white men, not Indians, and after all they proved to be the company of artillery, mounted on some Indian horses that had lately been captured from the Cheyennes. Under the circumstances, it was not at all strange that we had mistaken them for hostile Indians. The next morning after this, the wagon masters of these several trains came forward as usual, and we set out to travel in advance of the trains, hoping to find buffalo as we had again reached their accustomed range. I had the only real good buffalo horse in the company, but his speed and strength we found considerably lessened and impaired by the long journey. In discussing the prospects of finding buffalo and of killing one for a supply of fresh meat, which we were all very eager again to get, Hines, an assistant wagon master of one of the trains, suggested to me that I should use his pair of heavy Colt's Army revolvers, which, he said, carried a heavier ball and were more effective in killing buffalo than mine. Although I was somewhat doubtful, I exchanged with him. We had ridden forward but a few miles when we descried a herd of some 20 buffalo in the distance. The understanding being that I was to lead off in this chase, I put spurs to my horse, the others following. There were several young cows in the band, one of which I selected and pressed my horse forwards. In a few moments we were going at a furious rate of speed, and my prospect of success was good. But just as I was leaning forward, with pistol in my right hand, in the act of shooting the cow, the stirrup leather of my saddle suddenly broke, almost precipitating me headlong to the ground. But I escaped falling by catching around the horse's neck with my left arm. The heavy pistol fell to the ground. While I was preparing to mend the stirrup leather, having dismounted for that purpose, the other men of the party rode up, the buffalo, meanwhile, having run entirely out of sight. When I had gotten the stirrup repaired, Captain Chiles, noticing that I was a good deal shaken up and unnerved by the occurrence, said that I would better let him have my horse and pistols, which I readily gave up to him, knowing that there was no man on the plains who excelled him in a buffalo chase, or one more sure to provide fresh meat. So he mounted my horse, and I got upon his mule, and we all started off in the direction the buffalo had gone. We had by that time reached a section of rolling country on the cutoff across the bend of the Arkansas, lying in great ridges with valleys intervening. As we got to the top of one of these ridges, Captain Chiles, who was in front, exclaimed, "Look yonder at that band of elk." There they were, perhaps 200 of them, grazing in a valley a mile distant. I immediately claimed my horse, for I did not want to miss the opportunity of killing an elk, but the captain merely laughed at me and started down toward the elk in a gallop. The elk, seeing him, were soon all in motion, running in a great mass, stirring up a cloud of dust, soon passing from our view around the point of the ridge on the farther side of the valley, Captain Chiles following them closely, the horse at full speed. After they had gotten out of sight of us, we heard the report of his pistol 2 or 3 times, and our entire party followed in his wake until we had reached the point where we thought the firing had occurred. Finding neither Chiles nor any dead or wounded elk, the men all, except Reese and I, refused to go further and turned about towards the road. Reese, who was riding his big gray horse, and I on the mule, continued riding in the direction we supposed Chiles had gone, until we had ridden perhaps 4 miles, when I began to feel a little uneasy, expressing a disinclination to go further, as I was riding a worn-out, leg-weary mule with nothing but a belt pistol in the way of arms, and being in the neighborhood of hostile Indians. Reese said to me, "You remain here while I ride to the top of that high mountain yonder," pointing to a hill a mile farther on. "When I get there," he said, "if then I can neither hear nor see anything of Chiles or the elk, I will return here for you." Reese rode away. I remained alone for an hour or more. The danger of the situation made it appear much longer than it really was, no doubt. And finally, I saw Reese and Chiles coming, greatly to my relief. They were in good spirits, and as they rode up, Chiles said they had killed the biggest elk that had ever ran on the plains, giving me an account of his capture in detail as we rode back. End of chapter. Over the Santa Fe Trail by W.B. Napton, narrated by Paul Beauheart. Chapter 13, Captain Chiles' Chase. When Reese had got to the top of the mound, he saw Captain Chiles sitting on a horse, holding by a rope a huge bull elk. The elk stood in the bottom of a deep, narrow ditch, 10 feet deep, with banks almost perpendicular, so steep that he was unable to get up them or out of the ditch to assail his captor. Captain Chiles, when he first caught up with the band of elk, had made an effort to kill one with the pistols, but for some reason he could only get the pistols to fire 2 of the charges, and with these 2 he only wounded a cow slightly, not enough to stop her from running. He kept after the band, all the while trying to get the revolver to fire, trying every chamber, but with no success. After he kept up the chase for 2 or 3 miles, the large bull elk, being very fat, got too tired to keep up with the band, but trotted along behind, in fact, so far exhausted that Chiles could keep up with him with his horse in a trot. The captain despaired of being able to stop one with the pistols, and finding a small lariat I had brought from the Kiowas as we went out on my saddle, used for picketing my horse, resolved to try the plan of lassoing the big fellow. Being an expert in rope throwing, he had little difficulty in preparing the noose or getting a fastening around the top prong of one branch of the elk's great antlers. As soon as the elk found he was restrained by the rope, he turned about and charged on Captain Chiles with all the power and fury he could command. And twice or thrice the captain was forced to cut loose from him in order to escape his assaults. The rope was long enough to drag on the ground some distance behind him, so that the captain could recover hold of it without dismounting, reaching down and picking it up as the bull trotted away from him. He kept on after him for some distance, occasionally jerking him back and worrying him until he could hardly walk. Coming to the lower end of the ditch, washed out to a depth of 10 feet at a point a few yards above, he managed to guide the animal, bewildered as he was by the heat, together with the violent and prolonged exercise into it, leading or driving him along up the ditch until he got him in between the high banks of it to a place where the animal could not get at him, however anxious he was to do so. When Reese arrived, as above related, he found Chiles sitting there on the horse holding the end of the rope, but having nothing with which to kill the animal, not even a pocket pistol. Reese had with him a belt revolver, and, under the directions of Chiles, he carefully crawled to the edge of the ditch to within a few feet of the elk's head and killed him with a couple of shots in the forehead. The bull had not been wounded by Chiles, and no one but a veritable daredevil, as he was, would have undertaken the job of lassoing an elk under such circumstances as he did. But Chiles was a stranger to fear. Chiles, Reese, and I got to the camp about 2 o'clock, near 6 miles from where the elk was killed. After dinner we went out with pack mules and the necessary hatchets and butcher knives and 2 of the drivers to butcher the elk. The animal was a splendid specimen of his kind, sporting a magnificent pair of antlers, fully hardened and developed. It was fatter than any other animal of the deer kind I have seen before or since. We butchered and brought to camp on the pack mules every part of his carcass, including the antlers. The latter were brought home to Jackson County. We feasted on the flesh of the fat elk for several days, and my recollection is that I have never tasted better meat. The remaining part of the journey was uneventful, the entire party remaining with the train until we were within 80 miles of the state line of Missouri. Then, in company with Captain Chiles, I started, before daylight, to make a forced march to Westport. We rode 40 miles before we halted for breakfast, obtaining it at a settler's cabin in the vicinity of Blackjack, arriving in Westport late in the evening, in the latter part of September, feeling very willing to rest once more in a comfortable house and bed. I saw my friend Reese about a year after he had returned to his home in Missouri, still making a fight for life, but during the second year, he struck his flag and made a final surrender. At Westport, the drivers were paid off and disbanded, but I was not present to witness the separation of the company that had formed a companionship, offensive and defensive, during this long and tiresome journey across the plains. Doubtless, nearly all of them, in the vernacular of the Western Mountains, have crossed over the range. The end. If you enjoyed this reading, please make sure to subscribe, hit that like button, and check out friendlyfrogpress.com, where you can see where our collection of eBooks, paperbacks, and audiobooks are available. Friendly Frog Press, where the classics come alive. This is Paul Beauheart, signing off.